Hello, everyone. My name is Margarita Pinton Perez, and I'm the Community Partnership Leader with the Learning Network. On behalf of the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub, welcome to our webinar, Sustaining the Sector, Systemic Change to Address GBV Worker Wellbeing. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and hosting this virtual event on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenampewak, and Chenungton nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Today, this land continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We give our deep respect to the first inhabitants of this land and recognized that an acknowledgement of Indigenous land and sovereignty comes with the responsibility to understand the history and ongoing impacts of settler colonialism. These impacts continue to be felt in disproportionate and everyday ways against Indigenous communities. We also reflect on those who came to this land involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. As our work is focused on mobilizing knowledge to end the spectrum of gender-based violence, we also recognize that today these nations face disproportionate forms of gender-based violence and a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2 SLGBTQIA+ peoples. We recognize the responsibility for our work to be informed of the colonial imprint and harms that shape the experiences of GBV among Indigenous communities. Next, I'd like to welcome our presenters for today, Jen Gorham, Chris Mackey, and Samantha Fernandez. Welcome. Jen Gorham is the Director of Operations at Sexual Violence New Brunswick and has been with SVNB since 2006. She is currently the Project Coordinator for Maintain, Strengthening Collective Care, a nationally funded project addressing wellness in trauma-exposed workplaces. Chris Mackey holds a PhD in sociology. Their areas of research include feminist movements, collective organizing around gender-based violence, poverty and social inequality, and critical surveillance studies. In 2021, they published their first book, Ineligible: Single Mothers Under Welfare Surveillance with Fernwood Publishing. Outside of academia, Chris worked as the Director of Research and Policy at Women's Shelters Canada, a national nonprofit network of violence against women's shelters. Samantha Fernandez has worked in the field of gender-based violence for over 16 years with experience in community settings, both at the frontline and management levels. During this time, she has gained valuable experience in cross-sectoral partner engagement, trauma-informed approaches, as well as program design, development, and evaluation. For the last 2 years, Samantha has been leading the Building Supports for the GBV Workforce Project at the Ending Violence Association of Canada. You can find their full bios in the link that we are sharing in the chat. Please join me in welcoming our presenters. We will start with their presentations and then move into a Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us to participate in your webinar, and I'm happy to be joining you all from the Wabanaki Confederacy. The link that's been shared with the resource that has been developed by SVNB is the culmination of a 5-year project that was funded by Women and Gender Equality. And the purpose was to develop a promising practice into a best practice. And so I wanted to share some contact information simply because we've been having some challenges with our SharePoint. And so in the event that the link doesn't work for you, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to share any of the resources that I mentioned and of course the guide. So about 12 years ago, my partner, whose name is Matt, and I were sitting down on a Friday afternoon to debrief our week, and Matt handed me a glass of wine and asked me, "How are you doing?" And he nor I realized that at that moment, that question was a catalyst for our organization's journey towards collective care. Because I started to cry in a way where all of the fluid in my body was trying to come out my face. It was very dramatic. So after I'd calmed down and I got some rest, I took a few days off work. I went to work and sat down with my executive director and one of my coworkers, and we had a very intense conversation because as much as I loved working at SVNB and I wanted to continue in my work here, I knew that whatever was happening, whatever this experience of overwhelm that was going on, was not sustainable. And so at that time, that discussion prompted a number of responses. Some were immediate things that changed and happened on that day. And others have become a part of our day-to-day collective care practice here at Sexual Violence New Brunswick. So this definition on the slide that's in front of you has really become the foundation of how we as an organization approach this experience or this practice of collective care. Really what it's talking about is the idea that self-care, while necessary, is a very limited response to the impacts of trauma-exposed work. You can be the poster child for good self-care. You can get exercise and drink water and, eat nutritious meals and see your doctor and do all of the things that would be on a list of self-care. But at the end of the day, all of the yoga isn't going to end systemic violence, and particularly sexual violence within my work world. We cannot apply individual solutions to the consequences of systemic violence. So today I wanted to share a few of the highlights of what we've learned here at my organization over the past 12 years, and in particular over the past 5 as we've engaged in this national project. So one of the things that we saw, not only in our own organizations and then when we've been working with other organizations, but in the research through the project, was that as organizations who are committed to providing trauma-informed care engage with the principles of trauma-informed care, empowerment, support, safety, trust, choice, they often fail to or overlook the necessity of attending to the impact of trauma exposure on the helpers. And so if the same principles of trauma-informed care are not embedded within an organization, top to bottom, policies, procedures, the culture, and of course, service delivery, then often what happens is you find staff or volunteers or helpers within the organizations working in environments that fail to mitigate the hurt or harm or impacts of trauma-exposed work. And in worst cases, the organizations may be even perpetuating harm. So this was a really interesting model that we came across in some training that I took with Tend Academy. So Tend Academy is located in Ontario. And Dr. Patricia Fisher was one of the founding members of Tend Academy. She has since retired. But I took a training with her called Organizational Health in Trauma-Exposed Environments. And Dr. Fisher presented this complex stress model. So on the left, you see workplace stress, job stress, burnout lives here, toxic work cultures, so bullying, harassment, lack of diversity, lack of inclusion, sort of back channel or backstabbing type of practices, so a toxic work culture. So this unfortunately can be any workplace. But over on the right, we have this additional layering of stress that is a consequence of traumatic workplaces. So workplaces that are exposed to other people's trauma. So we can have direct trauma, which would be, policing, EMTs, folks working in medical, where they're seeing the trauma unfold in front of them. It's not happening to them directly, but they're seeing it unfold. And then we have indirect trauma, which would be more like my work world, hearing disclosures, working therapeutically, our support line. And so what Dr. Fisher talks about is not only is there sort of this additional layering of stress because of the exposure to trauma, but that traumatic workplace stress can create an amplification so that the experience of workplace stress can feel amplified, or it can feel easier or be easier to slip into burnout, for example. And this was a really foundational resource for us because it helped us understand the unique experience of our work here at SVNB. But then as we have done more trainings and worked in communities, this is a way that we've been able to explain to community organizations that may be experiencing things to go, well, this makes sense, what you're talking about in terms of the impacts on your workers because of the complex stress model. So then throughout our journey, we also spent time developing a model of collective care. And this model was inspired by an article written by Susan Silk and Barry Goldman. It was the 2013 article in the LA Times. And Susan Silk, who is a clinical psychologist, developed ring theory as a way to support someone who is experiencing crisis or suffering. So at the center of the ring, you have the person who is in crisis, and then we have a set of social nesting circles or rings surrounding the individual. So the closest ring level would be the intimates of the person in crisis, whether that's a partner or parents or children. And then as we move into the larger circles, we move further and further away from the person who is in crisis. And so according to Susan's theory, you should only offer support in to the smaller circles or to the person at the center of the crisis, while sharing your own feelings of upset or frustration or fear with the people in your own ring level or to the larger ring levels. And so in this way, we're ensuring that the person who's in crisis and their close supporters are only receiving support and not additional stress. So I remember reading this article and seeing this model and thinking that this was something that could be adapted to a collective care framework to help us navigate how we would manage the support dynamics within a trauma-exposed organization. So for SVNB, the person at the center of our care are survivors of sexual violence. The next ring level is the staff and volunteers. Those are the people who are working frontline, who are tactile with people who've experienced violence. The next ring level, managers, directors, EDs, that's my ring level. So while I am no longer frontline with survivors of sexual violence, my work is focused on supporting those who are. We have what's called an operations committee or a board. So the board's role is to support the organization and the managers and directors who are guiding the work. And then in this model, I also included funders because so often funding can determine the direction of an organization or where the focus is. And then of course, community, which often drives the funding. So we also spent some time figuring out what our principles of collective care are. And we wanted them to reflect trauma-informed principles, but we also thought that there was some unique characteristics that would be specific to us as an organization. And so we value transformative advocacy. We believe that people and systems are capable and worthy of change. So our work focuses on building trust and safety, obviously with community, but also within the ring levels so that people can continue to do this work and be well in it. We value support, so we work to empower ourselves and others through validation and choice. And we spend a lot of time with support because we were thinking about hope, and hope felt aspirational, right? Like, I hope things get better. And so we decided to lean into support because support is how you operationalize hope. People can feel hopeful when the support is there. So we stayed with support. Collaboration, recognizing the strengths and working together, of course, within our communities, but also within the ring levels of our organization. And how can we collaborate through the various rings to make sure that our culture, our policies, and our procedures are meeting the needs of our clients, but also our staff. Accountability, practicing empathy and thoughtful responses when harm occurs. And this is so hard. And we don't want to necessarily call out, we want to call in and call on. So absolutely within our community, but also when we as an agency have created hurts or harms, either internally or towards our community. So we practice accountability. And then finally, we practice intersectionality because within our own team here at SVNB, we all come to this work with intersecting privileges and oppressions, and we have to be mindful of how those may be impacting a person's ability to do this work, to be well in this work, how they may be experiencing the trauma they're trying to support, and how that may be showing up in their bodies. So these principles navigate and guide the relationships within the rings and between the rings. And anytime that we feel ourselves being pulled adrift, or we can tell we're not doing well, or our organizations may be being tugged into crises, these are where we come back to and rely on and ask ourselves, are we functioning within these principles? And then I wanted to just leave you with this, because we have a workshop that we do, a full day workshop around all of this content. And oftentimes organizations who have contracted with us for the workshop will ask where to start, like how to begin. And we struggled with this because we didn't want it to be like a checklist or feel that someone had to start at number one and you would move through this sort of linear process. It is a practice. It's something we engage with every day. But these are the areas that we have attended to that have been successful for us. So a champion team, ideally more than one person, but having an individual or a team who is focused on looking at the ways your organization is attending to collective care. How are we as an organization taking care of the people in the organization? An understanding of trauma exposure impacts, and the structural barriers to support. Of course, with the people at the center of our care, of course, for the people who are accessing our services and support, but also within the organization. The individuals who have power in your organization should understand this, should understand trauma, should understand the impacts of trauma-exposed work, and should understand that there are individuals within their organization who may not have the same access, who may not have the same supports outside of the workplace. And so how important that is to understand throughout the organization. A commitment to trauma-informed principles, organizationally, top to bottom. A commitment of time and resources. This cannot be side of desk. It needs to be something that there's a commitment to, and a recognition that whoever is tasked with being the champion team are going to need time in their schedules and are probably going to need some financial resources. Empathy and compassion. It can be really difficult to hear from the folks within our teams that they're not doing well, that's so vulnerable. And it can also feel like a judgment of our organizations. So staying in empathy, staying in compassion, and being prepared for those feelings of vulnerability. I can tell you that has felt, very, very intense when I have people on my team coming to me saying, I'm not doing okay, and I feel like SVNB could be doing better. And so we want to stay curious, not judgmental, really try to stay in that area of curiosity and of how could we do this? What could we change? How could we approach this differently? And then last, an intersectional approach to collective care. So that recognition that we're all coming to this work with different places where we may have barriers. So I'm going to finish and hand it over to, I believe, Chris.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen. So great to hear you present those findings in such a clear, accessible way. And it really resonates with some of the findings we had in our feminist brain drain study. So thank you for that. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm thrilled to be here speaking with some wonderful co-presenters, and of course, all of you joining and listening in today. We know you're all really busy and appreciate the time you're taking to join us for this conversation. I'd also like to thank the organizers, Anna Lee and Margarita, for organizing and hosting, and of course the staff I met behind the scenes today before the call started. And I want to extend my gratitude to the interpreters doing excellent work. I will do my best to speak slowly, which is not easy for me. So thank you for your patience. So to just start, kind of like Jen did, to give you a bit of context of how I come to this work, I've worked in anti-violence and gender-based violence spaces as a survivor, a researcher, educator, activist, board member, and organizer for almost 2 decades. And during that time, I've had the privilege of connecting with and working alongside anti-violence workers on local, provincial, and national levels. And in addition to this background in GBV, I was also a labor organizer for a large public sector union for 8 years. And this context gave me a lot of insight into how and why workers collectively come together to organize, as well as some winning strategies for workers to advocate for better working conditions and promising practices for what it means to build and create a healthy workforce. So in terms of the feminist brain drain study, while I was working at Women's Shelters Canada, which is a national network of violence against women's shelters, I had the privilege of leading our community-based research and visiting workers and leaders across the country. As a behind-the-scenes researcher, I don't have the same direct service experience, but I do have a lot of experience hearing from workers themselves, listening, learning, and holding space, and trying to understand what it means to do this critical work in a very difficult socio-political context, where funding is constantly in threat, the demands of the work are ever increasing, as we saw during the pandemic, and how workers balance their desire to do social justice activism, prevention work, and end gender-based violence, while also doing the critical and life-saving service work. This tension, I learned, is very real. So early in the pandemic, we heard from our provincial and territorial associations across the country that there was this HR labor crisis emerging. And we were hearing that it wasn't just happening to the frontline workers, it was also affecting leadership. So our talented workers were leaving the sector for a variety of reasons, but one we kept hearing over and over again was anecdotally from burnout. And from here, the feminist brain drain study was born to better understand and address the crisis that was affecting our sector. So what did we do? In terms of our methodology, it was driven by an advisory council of experts who are doing this work on the ground. We developed a mixed methods study with 2 key components. The first component of the study was in partnership with the Victimology Research Center out of Algonquin College, and we collaborated on a national online survey on vicarious resilience and worker well-being for victim-serving agencies. Of course, this included a subset of data regarding violence against women's shelters. And we found that the survey was completed by about 314 shelter workers from across the country. The second component of our research included, in the summer of 2022, 5 national focus groups with shelter management, frontline staff, former staff, as well as provincial and territorial associations. And through that, we spoke to about 45 individuals. And there was a third piece. While it's not technically a form of data collection, it really resonated with the action-based component of the work we were trying to do. And through that, we organized a national symposium where we brought together workers from across the country to discuss the preliminary results and findings, talk about actionable items moving forward, and to kind of build that collective momentum and connection after working in isolation during the pandemic lockdown. So what did we learn? For folks joining us today who work in the sector, these findings will not be a surprise to you. I will briefly summarize a few of the key findings and encourage you to read more in our report, which will be shared by the Learning Network folks after the webinar. So what I found really interesting while Jen was talking is there's quite a lot of overlaps with those collective care model that she developed in her organization with some of our key findings, which is really nice to see how research and actual practical applications of these learnings can manifest. So what I wanted to speak to a little bit is some of the findings are illustrated in this visual graphic that was created by Alina Gutierrez, which summarizes some of the key findings from a joint presentation we did with EVA Canada, which was during the Shockproofing Communities National Summit in March 2023. And so after analyzing the data we collected from our survey and our focus groups, we found that indeed there were some key trends across the sector that were happening that gave us some evidence of why folks were leaving. Many were connecting the lack of adequate and sustainable funding to the lack of adequate supports for workers. And so this was occurring alongside an increase in need and complexity of cases. Funding constraints result in wages that are not keeping up with inflation. A third of our survey respondents, for example, reported working an additional job to supplement their incomes, while 28% were thinking of leaving their current position or the sector altogether. And then some were leaving for similar and better paid work in the public sector. And hence this term feminist brain drain emerged. We were hearing from many in leadership positions that it feels like we're this training ground for the public sector for similar types of work. We also heard a key trend around workplace health and safety issues. These were a big concern for both managers and frontline workers. And what we learned was it wasn't just from the work itself, but also the workplace environment and culture. We received reports of exposure to violence and microaggressions, especially towards racialized workers, and toxic workplace culture. And the data showed that about 47% of staff reported declines in their mental health during the pandemic. So these gaps and challenges contributed to workers feeling unsupported and underappreciated at work, which led to workplace stress, burnout, and overwhelm. Yet we also learned that despite these very real challenges happening across the sector and across the country, the workers remained passionate and committed to ending gender-based violence. The study explored the concept of vicarious resilience and how staff grow and learn in their work, and how witnessing resilience of those coming to shelters, staff were able to build their own resiliency and hope. We also found that organizations are finding innovative ways, as we saw with Jen's collective care model, to retain staff and maintain high quality services. They are collaboratively and creatively creating workplace policies and practices to ensure that staff feel safe, connected, heard, appreciated, and valued. The data showed that when staff feel supported in these ways, they are more likely to remain in an organization. So now that I've laid a bit of foundation, I'd like to speak to the collective efforts to push back against these systemic factors that make it difficult to sustain and retain the workforce. So when we center this issue as a labor issue and a systemic issue due to some structural factors related to funding models and state oversight, this moves us away from individualizing this as a problem of individual workers or organizations. It's bigger than that. So while the research demonstrates that indeed, as Jen was talking about, this is difficult and taxing work, which can result in a lot of overwhelm, alongside often low pay, workers are burning out or walking away, not because they cannot handle the work, but because of other factors like workplace culture and the systemic issues we've been talking about today. And the thing to remember is that the workers are also very well aware of these systemic issues affecting the sector. And this adds to our stress, right? When we have to engage in advocacy efforts to ensure the viability of our work, programs, and of course, our salaries and the salaries of our staff. What's been interesting, and I've noticed since this study and EVA Canada study, is that we've been seeing workers and leadership openly and vulnerably speaking about the challenges and the potential solutions. There seems to be this collective rising of grievances alongside collective mobilization efforts to not only retain the workers, but to provide workplaces where they can thrive and succeed, where they can have work-life balance, access necessary mental health supports, and have supportive teams to do this meaningful work. This requires us to create systemic solutions to these systemic problems. The work that anti-violence organizations have done around the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence is a clear example of how GBV experts and leaders coming together to demand system-level change that is intersectional, transformative, and action-oriented. Yet far too often, we come together to create these roadmaps and recommendations, only then to be gaslit by funders who ignore the expertise that they had commissioned in the first place. The transformative change that is needed requires us to do it on all levels, from individuals setting healthy boundaries at work, to teams collectively debriefing, to leaders creating open, healthy, and transparent workplaces, to also organizers facilitating and coordinating systems level change. This includes, of course, advocating and challenging colonial heterosexist funding practices that keep our sector and our movements in a freeze response due to fear of losing our funding. So what I've been thinking about is how movement building is actually an important part of this work. After all, our sector comes from the feminist movement, from survivors, from the activists and volunteers who put it all on the line to fight back against gender-based violence. And I think that collective joy is also a part of movement building. We need to celebrate and honor the work that anti-violence workers are doing every day. In our communities, this work is often invisible, unacknowledged, and underappreciated. And at the national and funding level, it's not even recognized as essential, nor is the critical expertise of workers known or understood, despite the efforts of researchers and advocates providing ample evidence that it is. And yet, many community, provincial, and national organizations and network are centering this critical work and are recognizing it. While it isn't going to solve all the systemic issues, it is an important aspect of building collective power and momentum to do this important work together. If we want these system level changes, we have to do it together. YWCA Canada has started an anti-violence staff network, for example, connecting workers, providing that network so folks don't feel so alone, while also providing resources. In my own community in Ottawa, the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women is providing a program called On the Front Lines, resources for worker wellness for folks working in organizations that have limited benefits and supports. So there are many examples, including the Learning Network, where we are here today to share our knowledge and move that into action. How do we take that information and move it? These spaces are really important for us right now, especially given the polarizing political climate. So these are just some examples of collective care and how it's important in our efforts to end gender-based violence, because together we are stronger and we can have more of an impact. I'd also like us to think about collective care as movement building. So when I think about this, and I think about the folks on the call today who are working frontline or working in leadership positions, it might feel very abstract and unattainable and maybe unrelated to the everyday service work that's being done in these organizations. But it is happening. And workers and leaders are reflecting on what collective care means, how we come together and how we mobilize and change this wider culture that we're working in. And so I've heard of many examples of individuals just thinking through and questioning their relationship to their workplace and how they are showing up. We've heard about teams coming together to develop policies and practices and center worker well-being, as we saw with the collective care model. We also know that workers organize and unionize their workplaces to better advocate and bargain for different workplace labor conditions. And we also know of provincial and territorial associations who are creating these really meaningful spaces to have collective dialogue and also be a bit disruptive in those dialogues that we're having. We've seen also cross-sectoral panels bringing together nonprofit folks who are trying to build solidarity and movement capacity. And that's what we did with this symposium. The Feminist Brain Drain Symposium was bring together folks working in other sectors to engage and have meaningful dialogue with us on the state of work in nonprofits, but also adding the GBV lens to that. And of course, we have the national level, where several prominent organizations, such as EVA Canada, have not only prioritized research to understand labor and well-being issues affecting our sector, but to also develop and nurture networks, resources, and supports for frontline and leadership. What we've heard from folks too, when we had these national conversations and looked through the survey data, especially the qualitative components, is that we are more than just service agencies, despite the neoliberal efforts to erase and eradicate our political and activist roots. We were born from a movement, volunteers, survivors, and we continue to shape that work even if we've had to minimize or hide it to ensure that we remained viable and received our government funding to continue to support survivors. We are in a moment of collective consciousness raising, and we have some difficult yet pertinent questions to ask ourselves as a sector. What will it take to create healthy, strong, and vibrant workforce that we know we can be? What will it take to push back against neoliberal funding models, restrictions, and monitoring? What would it take to recenter movement building and mobilize collectively? What would it take for us to look inward to our sector and our organizations and address and repair the harm we have caused to various communities? How do we build that collective care and solidarity across different organizations, geographies, and spaces? And how do we take care of each other in this work? These questions can lead us to imagine something different that is built by and for the workforce without the oversight of the state. And to do this, we need to move out of this crisis mode that Jen spoke to so that we can get creative and bold. I believe that our radical imaginations coupled with collective power can transform our sector, our movements, and ourselves. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Sam. Thank you for listening.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted. Thanks so much, Chris. I'm going to move us along to the next slide. And really glad to be here to talk to everybody about sustaining the sector and finding ways to bring about systemic change. A little bit about me, I'm based in Oakville, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'm with the Ending Violence Association of Canada. And a bit of an introduction into who we are. EVA Canada is an organization that works to amplify the collective voice of those working to end sexual and gender-based violence. And we do this through research, education, policy work, advocacy work. We don't provide direct services to survivors, but our goal is really to work on system change efforts on a national scale. And for the last couple of years, we've been working on this project, the Building Supports for the GBV Workforce project, funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada. And really what that is about looking at what are those systemic factors that are influencing and affecting workers in this sector, and how do we address them? So let's look at what some of these are. we know that, as you know, the speakers before mentioned, there are individual factors, right? There's the impacts of trauma exposure. Jen talked about that so eloquently. Vicarious trauma, empathic strain, compassion fatigue. We have lots of names for these types of phenomenon. People also often come to this work with their own trauma histories. All of these things affect how you show up in the workplace and our general well-being at work. As well, there's organizational factors. There's policies, procedures, organizational culture, leadership styles and capacity, and all the decisions that organizations make that also end up influencing the well-being of workers. And then there's the systemic factors. So things like labor market trends. We saw the Great Resignation a few years ago. You know, there's a lot of precarious work in this sector. There's a lot of short-term, contract-based, grant-based funding. There's a lot of different perceptions about what gender-based violence work really is and care work, what that really is. There's misunderstandings of our work in society. All of those things can also impact how people really show up and experience wellness in their work. And we're going to focus on the systemic factors for today. Because systemic factors are the things that create conditions for either the individual or the organizational factors to be exacerbated or to be addressed. It creates sort of the context within which the individual and the organizations operate. So first off, I'm going to talk about, oh, this is a little bit off. We did a questionnaire on the GBV workforce last year, and it was completed by over 400 staff in the GBV sector. And GBV workers, for the purposes of this questionnaire, were defined as anybody whose paid or unpaid work routinely exposed them to survivors or perpetrators of GBV, the stories of survivors or perpetrators, and or the trauma caused by GBV. So this includes, of course, frontline workers, people doing the work with survivors individually. It also includes researchers, for example. It also includes educators. It also includes administrators who are working in GBV organizations. All of those folks were surveyed. And I'll share with you some of the results. All of this is on our website as well, so it's easily accessible there. So almost 40% of the people surveyed said that exposure to the traumatic experiences of others on the job negatively impacted their mental health. 60% of workers surveyed said that they work at a fast pace throughout the day, which we know contributes to stress and burnout. And 56% said that they often feel emotionally exhausted and are worn out due to their work. So we can see that emotionally, mentally, many workers are not really doing too well. In terms of working conditions, 1 in 3 workers who were surveyed said they do not feel they're fairly compensated for the work that they do. And we know that salaries in this sector are drastically low in many places. It varies across the country, but the work is not valued the way that other work is valued in, say, finance, in construction, in business, and the compensation and the salaries are not up to those levels. 1 in 4 GBV workers who were surveyed were also worried about becoming unemployed. And we know that this is an issue because there's a huge issue with ongoing stable funding for the sector. There's lots of grant-based funding that's out there, and that leads to a lot of worries for staff about funding cuts, programs ending, and consequently unemployment. At the same time, over 1 in 3 BIPOC workers who were surveyed were worried about becoming unemployed. So this does affect BIPOC and people of color more than others. At the same time, we know there's a lot of strength and resilience in this sector. We did find that when you do support GBV workers, it can really mitigate the negatives of the occupational stress. and help them thrive. And I'll share, this is a couple of quotes from folks who did respond to the survey. As well, workers feel really positively about creating change at the individual and the societal levels. People in this sector are mission driven. They are committed, they are dedicated to doing the work, and they want to make a difference. And they can see that they are making a difference, both on a one-to-one level and on a larger societal scale. So this is a document that we put together. You can find this on our website, kind of summarizing all of the other reports, studies, documents, projects that have been done over the last 5 or 6 years that have talked about worker well-being, about working conditions in the nonprofit and GBV sectors, and that have made recommendations on what we need to do to improve working conditions. So we put this together just to show how much work has already been done in this area. And out of all of these documents and projects and reports, we pulled all of the recommendations from them. And there were so many repeated recommendations. People have recommended the same things over and over and over again. And there were 4 main things that were recommended multiple times. One is that the GBV sector needs to receive annualized funding in line with other public services, including wage, benefit, pension parity with the public sectors. And I think Chris mentioned this before. There are a lot of situations where community-based, gender-based violence workers are doing very, very similar work to other workers and helpers in school boards, in hospitals, in publicly funded sectors. But the parity for pay is very, very off, and the benefits are not there. So we need to be able to advocate for parity with public sectors. Secondly, organizations in the GBV sector need to have stable, permanent funding. Short-term grant-based funding is not the way to go to sustain a workforce, and this is a major issue. Third, we need a comprehensive workforce strategy to be developed that addresses things like recruitment and retention, fair wages, professional and leadership development, equity and diversity, all of these things that many GBV organizations struggle with on a regular basis in regards to their workforce. And we need to put together a strategy to address these things on a national scale. And lastly, occupational health and safety concerns need to be recognized, they need to be researched, and they need to be addressed, including things like trauma exposure and the lack of appropriate mental health supports. Vicarious trauma is an occupational health and safety issue for this sector. It's not just an individual issue, it's an issue that we see across the country in workers in all kinds of GBV programs, and we need to treat it that way. So we put together this report called A Roadmap to a Stronger Gender-Based Violence Workforce. It's also on our website. It's accessible there, and it has all of the content that I just talked about. And it lays out certain steps that we need to take to be able to move these issues forward and really build out some systemic supports. So some of the steps that it outlines to address these conditions are, first of all, we need to create a workforce identity for the GBV sector. We need to build some collective visibility of who we are as a workforce, what we do, and why our work is important. Many individuals who are working in this sector understand that, but we need to communicate that clearly. We also need to build collective capacity to influence policy, influence systems, stakeholders, funders, decision makers. We need to build our capacity collectively to be able to have more of a say, to be able to find the people who have decision-making power and really influence the actions that they take. And we need to start putting together elements to actually construct a labor force strategy for ourselves and for our sector. And a lot of where all of these ideas came from are the sentiment that we heard many, many times over the last few years from people across the country doing this work, which is that no one really knows who we are or what we do. People don't understand gender-based violence work. They don't understand how complex it is, how difficult it is, how intricate it is, and what it takes to do this work. And so if people don't understand what the work is, they're not going to fund it adequately. So thinking about the work ahead at EVA Canada and what it is we're trying to do, we want to be able to do some work that will raise awareness and understanding of the GBV workforce and its needs. And we're doing that by creating a visual model that can be used as an online tool, which can help folks in the sector to educate people outside of the sector, funders, partners, people, other professionals that we work with who need to understand what this work is. We're also going to be looking at gathering data and research on issues of worker well-being. We need data to be able to support our claims for sure. We also have a GBV worker wellness network, which is a network of folks from different parts of Canada who are also working on very similar types of issues around systemic change. And so we're working with this network to stay connected to the sector and to also collaboratively move the work forward so that we're not working in isolation. And finally, we are going to be looking at creating a labor force strategy that will hopefully outline actions and recommendations to really address the issues that are faced by this workforce. And where are we going? Where is this taking us? We have sort of a vision for a strong, resilient, stable workforce. That's what we ultimately would like to see. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It may take many years to get there. But what would that look like if we could have a really strong, resilient sector? It would mean we would have adequate and equitable funding. We would have the resources we need to do GBV work well, to not have 6-month wait lists, to not have workers burning out, to have enough supports to make staff feel like their work matters, their work is important, to feel adequately compensated, and to have their health and well-being taken care of. It would also mean that we would have well-developed infrastructure across the sector nationally to be able to share information, share best practices, share data, have data collection strategies that actually pull data together across the sector so that we can see in numbers what this work looks like. It would also mean having a strong professional profile of GBV work so that people outside of our sector can understand what we do, can value what we do as essential work that is community-based. And so what can we do? How can we contribute? A few things. So consider rethinking the issues that we know. Many people in our sector do talk about things like vicarious trauma, but we have to talk about it and think about it a little bit differently. It is a systemic issue that happens across the sector. It's not just something that one singular person experiences in isolation, and they need to take more breaks and they need to go to a yoga class or they need to take a vacation. It's an issue that's happening all over the place. So we need to look for the systemic nature in the challenges that we are all facing together as workers. And we also need to engage in conversations to continually talk about this and to think about well-being and supports from an organizational standpoint, from a systemic standpoint, not just an individual one. And lastly, spread the word both in person as well as online. I invite you to follow us on social media, like, share, comment, do the social media thing. We need to be able to have these conversations in more public forums. So I will wrap it up here. Feel free to peruse our website. You can find all the materials that I talked about and much more in the Our Work section of our website. And I will pass it back to Margarita.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentations. To hear of the work that all of you are doing, and it's encouraging as well to hear and to think about what's being charted as a vision for the future and the work that you're doing in each of your regions. So I'll welcome all of us to be on camera. And we'll transition now into the Q&A period. We've received some questions from the audience. So the style for this Q&A period, we'll ask the question and then feel free. Maybe someone wants to take a lead or someone might want to, all three may want to respond. So leave it up to you as we do have time for this Q&A segment. So a question from the audience. How do you recommend that we celebrate milestones and successes as nonprofits that serve GBV survivors in the spirit of collective joy as resistance in an effort to reduce burnout and strengthen the movement?
Maybe I can start with that by responding to that, and then Chris or Jen, if you want to jump in. I would say celebration is such an important thing for us to do as workers and as organizations, but also to think about what it is that we're celebrating. And that it doesn't just have to be that we saw 100 clients this year, that's great, let's celebrate that. It could also be things as simple as, you know, we've been working together as a team for a year and been doing it well. Or we did something really new and really different with this particular client, this particular situation, this particular case, and it worked really well. I think we need to resist the traditional ideas that we've been taught about just more is better, more numbers are better, more clients are better, but also make sure that we're celebrating quality rather than just quantity, and celebrating ourselves and our resilience in addition to the work that we do.
Thank you, Samantha. That's a good reminder. Any others want to also share a response to this question?
Yeah, just to build on what Sam was sharing, in one of the there were 5 key themes across our research that came up through both the quantitative and qualitative data, and one of them was appreciation and connection. And going beyond, yes, how many people did we serve and all those numbers, but really getting to the heart of celebrating each other and even getting to know what other folks in the organization are doing. Sometimes we're kind of siloed off doing our own thing. So it's nice to, be able to connect and have a better sense of what folks are working on. And so some of the examples we heard of in our study were like Star of the Month or Staff of the Month, where, someone is highlighted as, their type of work they're doing and some of their learnings and lessons learned, as well as some of their successes in that work that they're doing. And, some folks talked about also like nominating a colleague for their outstanding work. So just kind of giving folks some recognition and teams that kind of recognition of the fact that they are doing this difficult work in a difficult context and how to support. And that's part of collective care, is appreciating each other.
And I can maybe speak a little specifically to working with clients, because of course at SVNB, our counselors and interveners are bound by confidentiality. There's very little to sometimes nothing that they can share. But when they do have permission, and sometimes that's the case, like we will have clients who are like, and can you let the other staff know? So when we have those moments where we can hear directly from survivors, the impact is so significant for the rest of the team who might be working within systems. So I can think specifically of our folks who are currently working within the justice system, who are working with police and crown prosecutors to do training with more trauma-informed approaches. And so to hear directly from a client that their experience in the justice system or with a police officer, was validating, was nourishing, they felt helped, they felt heard. It really does sustain the folks that are working in the systems, because sometimes they can just feel like they're just kind of in the slog and they don't know if they're affecting any change. So our counselors are really, really wonderful about sharing those wins and those stories. And then just on a like ridiculous sort of fun, one of the things we have at SBNB is a channel in our teams called Nonsense and Happiness. And it's just full of foolishness, like memes and birthday wishes, and we shout out to each other. And it can get kind of chaotic and hilarious, but it literally is that importance of how we can have some joy in this work. And Chris, I saw in one of your slides, Vicki Reynolds was highlighted, and like Vicki Reynolds talks so passionately about the need for joy in this work, or no one's going to want to join us. So those are some ways that at SBNB we do that.
Thank you both. Really great examples that you're sharing. So there's some questions that are coming in that are thinking about maybe at an organizational level, or thinking about working with leaders, organizational leaders. So there's a question here about, for all three, how do we speak about vicarious trauma as an occupational health and safety concern when it may be met with a response from leadership as a normal part of the job, while reframing it back as something often related to personal responsibility, so something related to self-care? What might be some strategies to reframe this question or approach this differently to be heard?
I don't mind starting, because that's a large part of one of the workshops that we present. And so and this is incredibly difficult, because if you don't have buy-in at that leadership or your board levels, a lot of times it's those working frontline who are feeling those impacts, who are trying to say, this is a real thing, this is happening. So I can say that one of the things that we do at SBNB is anytime a group is contracting us for a workshop, I've gotten to the point where I won't do the workshops if the leaders aren't in the room. Because if I go in and I'm doing this workshop, most often if there's no leaders, I'm not irritating the frontline people. They're not mad at me. They're mad at that the leaders aren't in the room. So the importance of having leadership participate in some form of training, orientation to some of the impacts that Sam had highlighted, like thinking about vicarious trauma and empathic strain. So that's really key. But I would say if you cannot get that buy-in, you cannot get your leaders to participate, that I think both Chris and Sam mentioned solidarity, the importance of solidarity teams. And so whether that's, you and two of your office mates working in solidarity to figure out ways to support each other, that's how movements start, very slow, small groups, making waves, making changes and having their voices heard, but working in solidarity with each other. But training at the leadership level is, to me, is paramount. It's truly the first step.
Yeah, and maybe I can add to that as well, and to say, so of course, just echoing the need for leadership to be on board with this, right? And for leadership to be involved in these efforts to respond to staff needs. It's so much more difficult if you're a staff person feeling that your leadership does not, recognize the importance of vicarious trauma and the fact that it's happening. But I will also say that there's responding, there's reacting to vicarious trauma, and then there's prevention. And often I think we don't put enough effort into the prevention part. It is something that can be actively prevented, right? And the ways you do that are by doing regular touch bases, check-ins, supervisions, debriefings after difficult incidents, making sure that you have that kind of support in your workplace to be able to lean on those folks when you need to debrief. You need to say, my caseload is really full of very, very heavy cases right now. I need to not take on more of those. Being able to do those things and set those boundaries are all ways that we preserve our emotional and mental health. And that can lead to, preventing vicarious trauma from really sort of taking over our mental emotional space. So making sure that we're putting efforts into those kinds of preventative pieces, and not just saying, oh, now it's happened, now I guess we got to deal with it.
and that they have to take it seriously, right? We have 2 national reports documenting that the vicarious trauma and the mental health and wellness of workers is a retention issue. We're going to continue to lose workers, talented workers that we spent a lot of time training and, cultivating all of their amazing skills as trauma-informed feminist workers. And the fact that it is a very expensive problem. Recruitment is a lot of work. It takes a lot of time and resources from an organization. And not only that, we're losing that institutional knowledge and we're losing someone from our community, right? So I think we have to think about what culture are we also trying to create. And I think what Jen was saying too about the collective, the power of collective, like why are unions powerful in workplaces? It's different in a nonprofit setting, these smaller organizations, but when workers can come together collectively and talk about this openly, and then be able to also engage with leadership in those conversations, really wonderful things can happen. And that also relates to this need for our second theme in our study was like strong communication with management and leadership, where we can have these conversations in the open rather than just trying to deal with them on our own, because it affects all of us. It affects the whole ecosystem of an organization if some workers are suffering, and then we'll lose them. So it's like, I think there's, there is a way that we can come together to have those dialogues and that are important and critical for everyone's wellness in our workplaces.
Thank you. Leading into some of that conversation about the identity of the sector and the organizing of the sector, there's also here, how do we balance a question here about how do we balance some of those needs and what's being outlined today, for example, that might require, a need to create a stronger identity in the sector, but even maybe professionalization and knowing how that may exclude or may not be accessible to everyone who's already a part of the field or sector. So how do we navigate that?
Yeah, I guess I feel like I'm starting a lot, but I guess I'll say, professionalization has been a big topic of discussion because it's really hard to balance 2 things. One, the recognition of the professional expertise that many people in the sector have through their education, through their training, through their years of on-the-job experience, with also many people have experience because of lived experience and come to this work with lived experience that is very valuable. And sometimes that can be seen as not being professional. So it's something that we, I think as a sector, have to negotiate and work through, being able to value and hold both things as being valuable. But it's the other piece that I would want to say, I think just related to the last question that we talked about that just came to mind. We have so much professional expertise in this field that we are losing, as Chris said, when people leave. And the amount of resources and time and effort and energy that it takes to replace people, to keep hiring people because they're burning out. If we could take that amount of resource and time and put it into developing staff, retaining staff, allowing them to grow into their own professional development the way that they are wanting to grow and put those resources into there, I think we'd be in a very sort of different place.
I'll move us if the others we can move on to some other questions as well from the audience. So there's a question here that many GBV shelters have specific criteria for hiring certain frontline staff positions that have only worked in shelters. Are there orientation workshops for people interested in working in GBV shelters so they can obtain knowledge and training that is recognized as valuable with GBV organizations? So we think about how some may have trauma-informed training, but not in GBV shelters. Is this something that people are considering or as part of that training of the sector?
I'm not sure if the individual meant like before they're hired on, kind of like you might be interested in working in a shelter. Here's some things to know. But what I can say is that for SVNB, um, with our volunteers who work on our support line, and then with any staff who begin their career or their time with SVNB, a large part of the orientation process is understanding the impacts of this work. We call it pathways to support. And so as they're coming on board and learning about working at SVNB, we are talking about the potential, the impacts that this work can have. And we want to talk about the fact that you are going to be impacted by this work. I think the quote is, "You cannot walk through water without getting wet." So you will be impacted by this work. And there are things that we can do as an organization, and that as a team, and then as an individual, to mitigate those impacts in order to sustain people in this work. So that is a significant part of our onboarding process, of making sure that we're being transparent, that we're being clear, that, when these things start to maybe manifest, the hope is that they'll connect to those that moment and go, "Oh, okay, wait a minute. Jen talked about this on onboarding, and I think this might be what I'm feeling." Because I think a thing that we've also noticed at SVNB is that, we're hiring from diverse places around the province, and people are bringing in toxic work culture patterns and behaviors with them, and that can take a while to unpack. So there's a process of trusting the trust. So when we say it is okay to use your sick time as a mental health day, and it's actually expected that if you've had this large week, we're assuming you're taking the Friday off and using your sick time, and people don't really trust that. It takes a while. So it's not so much a like welcome to the sector, but more of a welcome to SVNB that we've embedded in our onboarding process.
And to speak to the training part, one of the questions that came up as we were doing this work is, so where do people gain expertise and knowledge of GBV from? If they're working in a shelter, if they're working in a sexual violence organization, how do you learn that? And there are relatively few educational programs at academic institutions that really focus on GBV, or at least I know of very, very few that really focus on gender-based violence, risk assessment, safety planning, those types of things that you need to know in order to do GBV work. A lot of the training is on the job. It's shadowing, it's being trained by more seasoned counselors and advocates and therapists and all of that stuff. And so you develop that as you're going, and you train other people as you develop years of experience. And so one of the things that I would love to see in future is to actually have more of that training solidified in actual, training programs. And I think the Learning Network or CREVAC has recently come out with one. But things like that, I think, would be really, really valuable for the field.
Thank you both. I'll move us on to another question that was submitted by the audience. It feels to me that we are often pitted against each other for funding, and this seems to be a challenge in collaboration and unity in the field. Do the speakers have any suggestions on how we can work together in spite of the way our funding is set up?
I don't mind taking a stab at this one. I think that when we started our work on feminist brain drain, Sam reached out and was like, "We're starting a research project also on worker well-being in the sector." And we're like, "Okay, how do we, these are both government funded projects. How do we find a way to have the most impact with the work we're doing and not overlap and not compete and not create that weird animosity between two national organizations that is completely unnecessary?" So not only did we continue the conversation and dialogue through the whole process of our methodologies, of our data collection, of our processes, not in intense detail or anything like that, but we kept each other in the loop. But we also co-launched our reports together to show we are not going to buy into that division, and we are going to work together. And I think that amplified our work even more and reached more people and had a larger impact because we actually came together, brought our networks together, and showed that we don't need to be in competition. We're all doing this work together. We're all trying to move this work forward to end gender-based violence and support the workers doing this super important work in our communities. So yes, I mean, I think the funding structure is set up intentionally to create division and competition and this scarcity model that pits us up against each other. And we need to push back against that, which is really difficult and challenging, particularly when the service work is so demanding, right? And I think leadership needs to play a role in that. And I'm sure Jen and Sam have some awesome ideas around that as well.
Yeah, I will say this is a question that we have spent hours talking about, thinking about. And it's something that comes up because it's a constant in our world. The business model often gets translated and applied in nonprofit settings. The business model is based on competition, based on, market supply and demand, based on whoever's the best at this should get all the resources and should be. And it doesn't work well when you translate it into the service sector and the nonprofit sector. It's not an ideal model for us to follow. So a lot of this, I think, is actively resisting the ways that we've been taught to think and the programming we've sort of been taught to have about, we have to just sustain ourselves and this funding is available and we're going to go for it regardless of what everyone else is doing. Which understandably many organizations are in that boat. But trying to shift our mindsets around from competition to collaboration means looking around in our environment and saying, who else is doing work that's similar to this? And yes, we may both be trying to access funding everywhere we can, but how do we think about it differently? So if you are better positioned to take on this project, maybe you go for that and I go for something else. Or maybe we really combine our areas of expertise and create something new. Maybe we do it jointly. Whatever it is, trying to sort of resist that sense of competition that we always tend to feel because we're in a scarcity environment. And unfortunately, there isn't a clear, simple answer. But it's about slowly moving the needle, one bit at a time.
Jen, did you want to add to that? I can also move us on to the next question.
I think they've covered that beautifully, so thank you.
Yeah. So there's a question here that from the audience saying that debriefing has been talked about a couple of times and that they know that SVNB works to practice low impact debriefing, but they'd like to know a little bit more. What are some of the key guidelines, ways to debrief that don't result in, quote, smearing each other with trauma?
So low impact debriefing is actually a framework developed by Françoise Mathieu from Tend Academy. And if you go to Tend Academy and put in low impact debriefing, you will get a beautiful infographic that really goes into how to practice this as an organization. So they have a number of kind of, like, I always make the joke of, you're not going to print off an infographic and put this in your kitchen and then your staff are going to be immediately better. However, this is an infographic you can print off and put in your staff kitchen that will benefit and support teams. So low impact debriefing is really a 4-step process by which you know yourself, you understand why you need to debrief, because sometimes it's not debriefing, sometimes it's just gossip or wanting to have a chat with a coworker. So really, what is your intention? What do you need? What is it that you need to happen? Then we want to practice from communities of consent. We want to make sure, so if I'm going to Chris and I say, hey, Chris, I was in a school today and I had this large event happen and I'm I'm struggling, I need to talk about it. Do you have space? I'm trusting that Chris is going to know their body and nervous system and what they can navigate and say to me, yes, yeah, come on in, let's chat. Or, no, I'm full up, I can't at this time. So I'm making sure that I'm actively getting consent from the person I want to debrief with. Then we give heads up, we give fair warning, right? So we say, I've had an intense event, I've had something significant. We want to give the other person's nervous system that pause to kind of catch up and ready itself for a potential intense story or disclosure. And then you start on the outside edges. A lot of times when we engage with debriefing, we think we've got to go right in for that graphic detail, right? Like this is what I heard. But so often it's how we behaved or what we said or what we forgot to say or the question we forgot to ask. And so if we can just start on the outside edges of that and then work our way in, a lot of times we might get our needs met without needing to further expose our coworker to graphic details or some traumatic details. So that's a framework that Françoise and her team had developed that we use here, and really just coming from that place of consent, heads up, and outside edges, and it's been a good practice. But I will also mention that Tend Academy has recently done a really interesting training called Debriefing and Mutual Support. I was lucky enough to be able to take part in their virtual one that they put on recently, and they have done an amazing job at sort of looking at all the different models for debriefing. And I think it was mentioned in the question about the mental health first aid, and that's one of the ones that they talk about. So these are all tools that organizations can interact with to kind of support and facilitate lots of different types of debriefing within our organizations, because of course there's peer-to-peer, just sitting down in your office and having that, that co-regulation, which is important. But then we might need to have something more intensive, right? If there's something that's happened within the organization or we've had a crisis with a client. So their training at Tend Academy on debriefing and mutual support is really a training to help an organization develop their own internal practices around debriefing without being prescriptive of like, this is what you need. It's here are lots of different models. Here's the pros and cons. Here's some things to consider. And then it helps organizations develop their own internal models. So highly recommend.
Thank you, Jen. I'll move us on to, we have time for just a few more questions here. There seems to be a few questions coming in again about the leadership and management level, the systemic level here as well. So there's a question here, any tips to help leadership management to understand wellness at work in a holistic approach? In brackets here, less yoga class and seminar on more on time management and better working conditions, work-life balance. I see a few of you nodding, so feel free. I'd like to respond.
I'm going to start again, if that's okay, for Chris and Samantha. So I became a director at SVMB because of longevity. I've been here 18 years. And I think that is a common experience across the sector, right? People being sort of put into positions of leadership and management or EDs because they've been around the longest. And that has a lot of pros. But as a consequence, and it's one of the things that we talked about at EvaCan so much during the initial project, is oftentimes folks in leadership positions are not getting the appropriate training in how to manage, right? They might be great leaders and be able to kind of lead people through processes, but the actual act of managing humans is really hard and kind of weird and has rules and regulations that many of us are not taught. We like Samantha said, we kind of on the job learning, and not everybody is well suited to it. So I would say, that's a huge gap in our sector, is just appropriate management training for people in positions of leadership. So that's challenge A. And then challenge B is, how then do we get these folks to really hear and learn and understand about the impacts of trauma-exposed work? Because you're correct, right? Self-care has a role, and I love yoga, and we do yoga here on Fridays at SBNB, and it's great, but it has not solved the impacts of trauma-exposed work. It creates connection, we have a good time, but the grief and the ethical pain, the empathic strain that we're experiencing can't be solved with that. And the things that actually solve for that are boundaries and appropriate job descriptions and feeling empowered to control your work day and say no to things as they're coming in, and succession planning, and making sure that people are adequately paid so that outside of work they can access whatever private supports they might need. So it's like, again, Samantha said, it's a slow, long process. I felt overwhelmed by only having 15 minutes to talk about the work that SBNB has engaged with over this past 12 years. But I think what I would say is squeaky wheel. And like, even if you can go to your workplace to go today, we heard a great workshop. Oh, for some reason oops.
Yes, me too.
If you can go to your workplace and say, we were in a webinar, and mentioning the research that Chris had mentioned, and that the work that Eva Ken has done, like, this isn't just made up people kind of going, oh, this work is hard. Like, the research is there. And so squeaky wheel, I would say, is a good, it's not great, it's exhausting, but it's a starting point.
And if I can add to that very quickly, I think Jen covered most of the points. Having been a manager at a community-based frontline GBV organization definitely resonates with me as well. I think I've experienced a lot of the similar things. But to that last point, sometimes we do need data. We need something to be able to show that this is not just a me issue. And so, some of the stats I talked about, we also have an infographic about that to show that this is what is happening in the sector. And if you can use that to say, here's the data nationally, what is happening nationally, and this is how it's showing up here. On our team, we just had 3 people quit and leave in the last 6 months. The turnover rates, the whatever it is, so using the national information, the national data, and relating it back to your local individual experience. Perhaps that's a tactic that makes a difference. But then also showing the cost benefit analysis, right? Of going back to the point around the amount of resources that go into training, onboarding, hiring, interviewing, contract negotiation, all of that stuff. It's a lot of management time and resources. And if there was even a fraction of that time and resources that we can put into sustainment and maintaining, perhaps that could make a difference.
Thank you. So that is all the time we've had. You've left us with so many beautiful offerings and information. Thank you so much to our presenters, Jen, Chris, Samantha, so much. Thank you for the time you've taken today to share your expertise, the research, the tools that you've mentioned. I want to also say thank you to our ASL interpreters, Tammy and Marcia, and our French language interpreters, Sylvie and Caroline. Please, for all of you that are listening in and watching, don't forget to complete the evaluation form to receive a certificate of participation, and the link will automatically open in your browser after the webinar has ended. Thank you very much for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar. Take care.